This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Presumed Guilty. The author is Scott Turow. In a sequel to Presumed Innocent, the book that redefined the legal thriller and served as the basis for the Apple TV's most watched drama series ever, judge and lawyer Rusty Sabich returns to the courtroom to defend his stepson against a murder indictment as the boy's life and perhaps Rusty's last chance at happiness hang in the balance. Rusty is now a retired judge attempting a third act in life with a loving, soon to be wife. But the piece that's taken Rusty so long to find evaporates when B's young adult son, Aaron, living under their supervision while on probation for drug possession, disappears. Aaron eventually turns up with a vague story about a camping trip with his troubled girlfriend, May. Days later, when she still hasn't returned, suspicion falls on Aaron. And when May is subsequently discovered dead, Aaron is arrested and set for trial on charges of first-degree murder. B begs Rusty to return to court one last time to defend her son. For Rusty, the question is not whether to defend Aaron or whether the boy is in fact innocent. It's whether the system to which he has devoted his life can ever provide true justice for those who are presumed guilty. Scott Turow, a former practicing lawyer, is the author of 13 best-selling works of fiction, including Presumed Innocent and most recently Suspect. Mr. Turow also has published two nonfiction books, including One L, about his experience as a law student. His books have been translated into more than 40 languages, sold more than 30 million copies worldwide, and have been adapted into movies and television projects. He has frequently contributed essays and op-ed pieces to publications like the New York Times, Washington Post, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic. I am happy to have Scott Turow back on Speaking of Writers. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. It's nice to be back with you.
What was the inspiration for this story?
Well, we can take that question at many levels. In terms of why I wanted to write about Rusty again, about 20 years after Presumed Innocent, I wrote a first sequel called Innocent. And I left Rusty in such an unhappy state, just released from prison with his life basically shattered, that I felt I was not being completely fair to him. I didn't want myself or readers to think of him uh, quite that way. So I figured I would take up the story again. The other piece of this is that I've always been really, fascinated. It's not a theme that's new to me. It's been written about many times, but the idea of what happens when somebody in a household is accused of a violent crime, especially a crime like murder. Uh, you've got my friend Bill Landay who wrote Defending Jacob or Rose Ellen Brown's Before and After. And I always looked at those books with jealousy because I thought, wow, that's always it's just got that's great dramatic fodder. Um, put love and loyalty in contest with the legal system.
The character of Aaron, how did you create him?
Um, he has no real world correlative. Um, he's he is a product of my imagination. And Aaron's got sort of special demographic characteristics in the sense that he's a mixed race kid whom Americans would refer to as black. Um, and he's been raised by white parents. B, Rusty's fiance, adopted Aaron as an infant. And through the, intervention of her college roommate. And so, he stands in a remarkably uncertain place in American life as somebody who's been raised in the white community, but is always first judged by his appearance.
Let's talk about Kendall County. All right, how would you describe it?
Well, the story of Kendall County is fairly simple. Um, when I started writing Presumed Innocent, I was writing on the morning commuter train. And it was based on experiences I had when I was an intern in the Boston District Attorney's Office. So at first, I was clearly writing about Boston, but it took 8 years to write the book, and it became more and more. It being Kendall County became more and more like Chicago. And so um, I changed the name. Obviously, Boston would no longer do. And so you've got a city roughly the size of Boston and that kind of a metropolitan area, but set in the Midwest. And, if you wanted one city that would be most like it, you'd say Milwaukee. But, it certainly partakes of the Chicago that I grew up in and still return to.
Next year, it'll be 40 years since the release of Presumed Innocent. It really helped establish the modern legal thriller genre. What do you enjoy about the genre, and has it changed over the decades now?
Well, the so-called legal thriller, it wasn't even called the legal thriller when Presumed Innocent was first released, but the legal thriller depends on, because it's been part of the educational process for the American people about the law and the way the legal system functions. And so as that education has evolved and frankly increased. So have the books about it. I always, as an example, when I wrote Presumed Innocent, if you go back to it, you'll find an explanation of what a sidebar is. Uh, and people who watch, law shows on TV or have read, some of these books, nobody needs an explanation of what a sidebar is anymore, with the judge hanging over the side of the bench to talk to the lawyers out of earshot of the jury. Um, and that's an example. And I think, frankly, Presumed Guilty takes advantage of some of that enhanced education about the legal system. And I probably am able to go into more detail about how the system operates in Presumed Guilty than I ever have before. And I hope I do it without losing momentum. That seems to be a fairly consistent comment that's what's happened. But I'm not sure I could have done that when I, wrote Presumed Innocent, whatever it was, 35 years ago.
How do you think you've evolved as a writer after all these years?
Um, I do spend a lot of time thinking about that. When you are a young writer, which I was a writing fellow out at Stanford, um, fresh from college. You're trying to define yourself. You're trying to figure out where you fit in the conventions of fiction that you're becoming familiar with. Um, and you know, by now I know the answers to those questions. I know who I am and what I can do and what I want to do. And I'm not trying as I once did to be the next James Joyce. And you know, I, but I'm dreadfully frightened, even though I've written in this same small space, I'm dreadfully frightened of repeating myself. So, and as I said, that's one of the reasons that I'm happy that Presumed Guilty kind of covers different ground in the courtroom. It's a different place, this rural county where Aaron ends up getting tried, as opposed to Kendall County. So there's lots of variations and a much different kind of jury and a much different kind of prosecutor.
Scott, what's the story behind you becoming a writer? I understand your mom was an inspiration in your DNA, right?
Yeah, my mom always wanted to be a novelist, and she didn't go do a good job of pursuing that. She was the person who ran the household, and much as I love her, I probably learned a lot about discipline from watching my mom because she lacked that. My dad, on the other hand, was kind of a relentless personality. Um, so I realized early on that even though I was taken by her dream of being a novelist, that you were not going to accomplish that unless you put your behind in a chair every day and tried to write. So, but I had the decision to try to become a writer was one of such conflict in my household. My dad was a doctor, and my mother and he both wanted me to become a doctor. I had no interest in that, and how you're going to support yourself, um, and it was so much part of the definitional struggle between me and my parents that I spent a lot of time wondering if I had talent or I just willed myself to become a novelist to sort of show them and break away from them. And, you know, I'll never know the answer.
Yes, so many authors, of course, getting that butt in the chair, the discipline that I've had on this podcast. I remember interviewing the late, great Elmore Leonard years ago. And Elmore said, I always remember he said, you write a page a day, you'll get a book. That's it. That was always his goal.
Yeah, the great American novelist Wallace Stegner was one of my teachers when I was at Stanford, and Wally wrote 2 pages a day every day of the year except Christmas. And he said the worst thing that happens is that at the end of a year you have 730 pages, and in 730 pages there has got to be something worth saving. And of course, in both those cases, Leonard on one hand and Stegner on the other, they wrote, uh, there was a lot in there, 350 or 700 pages worth saving. Um, but, the story doesn't happen. The imagined world doesn't begin to congeal unless you return to it every day.
Does the story come to you first or the characters?
Uh, well, I mean, obviously, with Presumed Guilty, I started with Rusty.
Mhm.
Although, the idea of writing about a family um, where somebody, a kid, is accused of murder, as I said, it appealed to me for years. And it was a while before I realized, wait a minute, Rusty's going to be that would-be parent. I'm going to have to pardon myself for drinking water. That that troubled parental figure who's watching a kid in the household get accused of having done something horrible. Um, so the story idea, I guess, was there even before I realized who was going to be the focus of it. And I'm sorry. But people say afterwards, how did this happen when you're talking about a book? And it becomes hard to remember. Um, but book about a family torn apart by an accusation, wanting to write about Rusty again. And then once those two things were there, the most essential element of the story that Rusty's going to be pressed back into the courtroom um, had came to me. And so I don't know if that answers your question. It's just one example, but
Does writing energize you or exhaust you?
I mean, I think at a deeply spiritual level, it energizes me. It's the best I feel um, when I'm writing well. I get up in the morning, I read the papers, I start writing. Um, and, when it's going well, it's a day very well spent. Uh, and, uh, it is exciting, as I said, to enter this imagined world, uh, which, to the inner 6-year-old feels like a real place.
And what is next for you and your writing?
I took a little time when I finished Presumed Guilty to figure out if there should be a next. I'd never really asked myself that question before, but I think it was healthy because, you know, I decided, yeah, I want there to be a next. I enjoy this too much to simply put it aside. I don't think I'd stop writing. The question is this the moment for me to sort of turn my hand to something more autobiographical? I've always wanted to do what I'd call a commonplace book that's sort of like Norman Mailer's Cannibals and Christians, something that sews together, uh, things I wrote at different times in my life and treats it um, as basically the framework for some kind of autobiography. And I'll do that. I'm sure I'll do that, but it's going to be another novel next.
What do you like to do when you're not writing? I know you're a big sports fan.
I'm a big sports fan. Um, Years ago, I was doing an interview with a reporter, and I answered, "Oh, well, I don't really watch much television." And out of the next room comes the voice of one of my kids yelling, "What do you call ESPN?" So I do watch a lot of televised sports. Uh, One advantage of being in Florida in the winter is I play a lot of golf. I've become um, more serious about tennis than I expected. Don't play as much pickleball. I'll play, um, but I've decided I like tennis better. And I think of pickleball as a sport invented by the orthopedic profession, with in the hopes of featuring business. I've watched a lot of people get seriously hurt playing pickle. So, but generally, right in the morning, attend to business, go exercise. And whether it's golf or working out in the gym or tennis, um, that's sort of the routine. And at the end of the day, you feel healthy and good.
And I know you're going out on book tour soon, but my question is, Scott, when are the rock bottom remainders? When's the band getting back together and then going
Oh,
out on
Steve,
tour?
you missed your chance. We played in November at the Miami Book Fair,
Mm,
uh, and we had a lot of fun, as we always do. I say we, although anybody would look at me and say, with complete accuracy, uh, in a group of some very good musicians and some very bad musicians, I am without question the worst, especially of the people who perform. So, but we had a great time. Steve King, who is not always along, was there. And frankly, Steve's presence makes things both humorous and special.
mm.
The band did a panel at the Miami Book Fair, and you had a lot of well-known writers sitting up there. You had Mitch Albom and Dave Barry and Amy Tan, and you know I'm not even naming everybody off the top of my head, but you know they, they opened it to audience questions. Every question was for Steve King.
Mm.
Every question was for Steve King, and well, it should be. He's clearly the transcendent popular writer of our generation.
So the band won't be at the Savannah Book Festival coming up in February.
Oh, it will not be. It will
Okay.
not be in Savannah. But
Well,
the people in Miami, frankly, have been hosting the band occasionally for years, and they know the drill. And it's not easy. There's equipment to get. There's a couple of ringers. No rock band survives with an amateur drummer.
hmm.
So, great drummer named Josh Kelly performs with us. Terrific horn player named Rosmo Paulo. So, the ringers have got to travel and come in. You need a sound guy, and for a book fair, that's not familiar
Yes.
from stuff. So a place like Miami, they've done it before and they know how to do it.
He is Scott Turow. The book out now is Presumed Guilty. He will be on book tour. If your indie bookstore does not carry it, ask them to get it. Shop local. Scott Turow, thank you so much for joining me.
Steve, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And please hit the subscribe button on this Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards.